And welcome to Conversations. I'm Jeff De Forrest. Very happy to have you guys with us for another edition of the program. And this is always great because you're thinking, as a matter of introduction, how shall I bring this person on board? And you start looking at the list of distinctions. And in the case of Len Elmore, our guest on today's show, they're not only numerous, but they're diverse. I mean, they're all over the place. Whether you were talking about being a Harvard law graduate, being a prosecutor, being an attorney, being an all ACC player, following in the footsteps of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor at Power Memorial, and of course, growing up in Brooklyn and Queens, where he got his start. We welcome a very distinguished gentleman, a member of many committees, and always somebody that people seek advice from. What was also a great commentator on basketball. We'll get into that, both college and pros. We welcome Len Elmore to Conversations. Len, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing okay. It's good to be with you, Deepak.
Well, it's good to have you on the show. I remember, and I'm thinking about people that I'd like to have conversations with. And I remember many times when you were booked on our radio shows, I came away thinking, "My God, that guy is the smartest guy I've ever talked to in my lifetime," and nothing but great opinions. So it's a pleasure to have you in this platform and here with Conversations. Let's go back though, because we're about the same age. You look far younger than I do, but we're within a year of each other, and you grew up like Brooklyn, Queens, like I did. And what's funny, I mean, with your distinguished career in basketball, uh, basketball wasn't really a big game. I mean, did you grow up playing punch ball, shooting marbles, playing skelly? Running bases was big. Any hybrid form of baseball was huge back in my youth. We didn't play a lot of basketball. What was that like growing up in that environment for you?
Except for marbles, all of the above.
Marbles. Okay, you didn't do
I
marbles then.
remember, I remember playing Skelly. We played stoop ball. We played wall ball in the handball courts.
Chinese
But yeah,
handball, it was known as, yeah, with the
yeah,
ace queen or whatever that was, ace king in the boxes. That was a great game.
yeah. Baseball was really big, and that was the first sport that I ever played. And I became a Yankee fan at 6 years old. My grandparents were going to disown me because they were Dodger fans, but the Dodgers had left. And
Yeah,
my
they were gone.
father, my father was trying to teach me the game through Willie Mays and Monty Irvin with the Giants, but they were gone. And so the only team left were the Yankees. And, I picked that up. It was the first sport that I played and didn't really get into basketball until I was about 13, 14 years old.
I'm kind of with you on that. I actually had moved to Long Island by the time my parents moved there when I was 11, and we still played a lot of the games, the street games that we played in New York as our most promising and frequent entertainment. But yeah, I didn't really get into basketball until I was about 15 or 16 on any kind of serious level. And I was very fortunate because, and I don't know if you agree with me, this is a personal bias of mine, Len, but I always felt like whenever and I was one of those guys, I loved basketball so much. If there was a game going on, no matter where I was, I stopped. I wanted to, hey, can I run with you guys? I just wanted to get into it at any park in any city. And I always found, and I don't know if you found this through your career because you managed to mix with a lot of different players on the college level, high school level, pro level, that the fundamentals that you learned in New York were far and vastly superior. We all played like the '73 Knicks, where there was ball movement and picks away from the ball and unselfishness. Even Earl of Pearl Monroe could tone his game down and average 15 a game and be content with it, even though he was capable of scoring 40. But it seemed like the players that came up from Long Island, New York City, were far more fundamentally sound than you got in other areas. Did you find that to be the case?
Oh, there's no question. It's a team game.
Spoken like a true New Yorker, my friend.
It's a team game.
Yeah.
And when we moved to Queens, that's when I really started to play basketball. And most of it was half court. And, and at that time, in some neighborhoods, you had to get the rebound and bring it back across the free throw line. Other neighborhoods, you got the rebound, you put it back up. But the reason why we played a team game is because you wanted to stay on the court. You lose, and there's so many guys waiting for winners, you weren't getting back on the court. So any guy that went off on his own, as we used to say, he went nut. Guys like that would get kicked off the team because he'd hurt your chances of winning and staying on the court.
That's funny too. I mean, because there are legendary characters in New York basketball, and I don't know if you were ever involved in Rucker leagues or anything along those lines. My Among my initial experiences, we were on, and there would be a court where 40 guys that were standouts would gather to play 4-on-4 or 3-on-3 basketball. In this case, it was mostly 3-on-3, and I'll never forget the team that would grab the court first was comprised of a 16-year-old Dr. J, former coach of the Knicks, Dick McGuire, and a kid that was either at Archbishop Malloy or St. Agnes Prep, which I'm sure you're familiar with both of those schools, playing at Power Memorial, named Eddie Malloy. And they would grab the court at the beginning of the night, and you'd come out there and challenge, lose 11-3, and then you had to go down to the other court where some guy was shooting with his kid that might have even been physically impaired, and you would say, "Hey, can we run with you?" Because you knew you weren't getting back out there. So I know exactly what you speak. Were you that guy? Like everybody wanted to naturally run with the doctor, even though he wasn't that flamboyant player became in the ABA. He essentially just stood under the basket and dunked, which nobody else could do. But were you that guy in the games that you played when you were growing up as a kid?
As I got better, initially, not really. I mean, it took me a while to develop. Took me a couple of years to really grab the gist of the game. I know that goofing around in junior high school, that's where I was discovered by a gentleman by the name of Howie Evans, who worked with Mike Tyson for a while, but he was a writer for the Amsterdam News, and he was the substitute PE teacher at my junior high school. And he saw me goofing around with some of my classmates in the ninth grade, saw some athletic ability, even though I didn't have basketball aptitude, brought me down to Power Memorial for what ultimately I realized was a tryout. And having played nothing but half court, I wasn't even sure which way to run. When they had the opening tip, they tipped the ball. I was still standing at half court looking around. How do you guys know which way to run? But I got accepted to Power. My sophomore year was kind of a learning experience, but I guess I learned well that between sophomore and junior year, we did play in the Rucker. Got my game handed to me a few times, but I learned. My junior year I was all city in New York, and my senior year high school All American. So playing in the Rucker certainly helped. And as I got older, yeah, I was one of those guys that could stay on the court for a long period of time, considering my teammates and the fact that we knew how to play.
All right, you mentioned Power Memorial. The first thing everybody thinks of is, oh yeah, Kareem went there.
Yeah,
And what was
absolutely.
he, about 5 years prior to you? How much of
Yes.
an influence was he? I mean, obviously, he went on to UCLA and then was drafted in the pros and won a championship with the Milwaukee Bucks right away before a distinguished career with the Lakers. You could make the case, I don't know how you feel about it or how close you were to Kareem, but you could make the case that he was the greatest of all time, certainly worthy of being in that discussion. Was he influential in UA going to Power Memorial, or did you have much contact with Kareem? And how much did his legend kind of dominate conversations about players from there, and especially being a big man? I would imagine the comparisons were very frequent.
Yeah, unfortunately. No, just
You didn't develop a little
I
sweet
will tell
hook,
you
huh?
this. The first time I met Kareem was my rookie year with the Indiana Pacers. The first game in Market Square Arena was an exhibition game. We were still in the ABA. He was with the Milwaukee Bucks, and we shook hands. That was the first time I had ever met him. But when you ask, was he an influence? Absolutely. And it wasn't basketball, believe it or not. It was the academics. It was the way he carried himself. It was his political activism. All those things really struck me as a 15-year-old playing at Power Memorial. Now, of course, when you talk about comparisons, when I got accepted to Power and started practicing, there was a newspaper writer for the New York Times, Sam Goldapper, who came over to interview me and wrote an article making those comparisons. And, I had to scratch my head. Of course, those comparisons continued until, my first couple of days of practice, and they stopped for a long period of time. Uh, but it was still something that I'm certainly proud of following him. But again, his influence was less about basketball, more about the person he was, the academic, that type of pursuit. I was recruited by just about everybody my senior year, including UCLA. But originally, when I got the call from the coaching staff, I had to tell them right off, I love you guys. I follow UCLA, but I followed this guy once. I'm not doing it.
Maybe a wise choice there. Yeah, it's always better to follow somebody that maybe wasn't nearly as significant in what they did into a job. That's kind of how I made my ascent in the broadcasting business. Always follow somebody that the rest of the public is sick of, and you become that so-called breath of fresh air. All right. And what was interesting too, and I've always wondered about this. I don't know if you have any insight into it or not, but I know we're going to talk later on about the state of college athletics, and it's something that you've been dealing with as part of your commitment to the Knight Commission, and always were great. And it's one of the things I always remembered about our conversations when you would speak about the changing face and landscape of college athletics. And now it's to the point where coaches are just saying, "I've had it. That's it. I can't deal with it." I think it really evolved beyond the scope of anybody's wildest imagination in terms of being something that was somewhat under control of the NCAA to now just total and open bidding wars and chaos. But as you were looking at UCLA and Kareem, there would have been maybe a temptation to follow him out there, except for his greatness. But did I mean, he was a guy that was supposedly didn't want to leave his bedroom. So how did he end up in California? Was there? I mean, the wooden regime was beyond reproach, you would think. But a friend of mine a long time ago wrote an article about Sam Gilbert being a big influence on the players there. What do you think? I mean, was there something more to it than Kareem's desire to see the Pacific Ocean that got him out to UCLA?
Sure, Sam Gilbert's legend persists, and even though he's gone, I had a chance to spend some time with Bill Walton.
Okay.
We became friends in our legend before our legendary game back in December of 1973, when they were ranked number one in the nation. We were number three, and we lost to them by one at Pauley. But I had a chance to visit Bill, who, as I recall, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty much sure that he lived in a guest house on Sam Gilbert's property.
No
So, I
surprise.
mean, look,
You didn't
as an attorney,
there's
as a former prosecutor, I mean, you put the circumstantial evidence, creeps up. You put it
yeah.
all together. I'm sure he had some influence. There's no question about it. And as I said, that was part of the college game, not as prominent in many ways as it is today, without strong NCAA regulation. But yeah, I would assume that Sam Gilbert played a role in Kareem's matriculation at UCLA.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't even open a letter from outside of town, but all of a sudden he ends up there, of course, with the Wizard, and it was a shocker. My friend Alan Greenberg was a writer for the LA Times, and he did this big expose about Sam Gilbert's influence, big booster, and you started reading the stories and thinking, you got to be kidding me. Even the Wizard is dipping into that under the table cash. That seemed almost impossible to conceive of. All right, you end up playing for Lefty Driesell at Maryland. How did that come about? And give us a little bit of that experience because you were in some phenomenal all-time classic college basketball games. And as you mentioned, you went against Walton in what was one of those instant classics, and also that ACC championship game against NC State may have been one of the biggest thrillers in college basketball history. So how did you end up at Maryland, and how would you characterize the experience with Lefty Driesell, one of the legendary coaches?
Well, originally, as I said, I was really set on going to St. John's. As I mentioned, we moved to Queens, lived about a half hour from St. John's, and my sophomore and junior year, I'd go up and visit John Kress, who was Lou Carnesecca's assistant. He and I became pretty close, and I would go up, practice a little bit on their floor, I'd scrimmage a little bit with their guys, spend some time with Kress, spend some time with Coach Carnesecca periodically, and I was set. But between my junior and senior year, Coach Carnesecca decided he wanted to coach in the pros. So they left to coach the Nets. And, they were succeeded by a gentleman who was a former Marine, buzz cut, and obviously ideologies didn't mesh. at that time. I was, really focused on politics, the war in Vietnam. I was obviously a protester. Civil rights movement was still in swing back in the late 60s. And suddenly, Lefty Driesell, after his first year at Maryland, he and George Raveling, who I became close with, came to visit our school. And after that, I started getting a letter nearly every day from one of the coaching staff at Maryland. Now, I visited other schools. I ran the gamut. I visited some schools in the Midwest. I visited even Duke, which, Hubie Brown was the assistant back then. And, Hubie Brown almost got on his hands and knees to beg me to visit Duke just to take a look at it. I went down there, and I loved that campus. A lot of Northeasterners, but I was wondering, okay, what happens when I step off campus in Durham, North Carolina, 1969? Remember, I'm a New Yorker. I'm accustomed to a lifestyle that's vastly different, probably from some of the brothers' experience down there.
Yeah.
But going to Maryland was a great visit. The Cole Fieldhouse held at that time was where we played. 14,500 fans. I went to an all boys Catholic school, so I said to myself, what happens? I'm going to take a look at the first 10 women, and if they're all good looking, maybe I'll go here.
Yes.
Yes. So that was another reason. And, finally, it just came down to Maryland, probably Princeton, who my mother really enjoyed, Coach Carrill. A quick story, he came to visit our home, brought the football coach, one of the football coaches, who was African American, to show diversity and the unity. Coach sat down on a couch that my mother had had in our family for 2 generations, broke the leg on the couch. My mother was very quiet, but Pete Carrill, God rest his soul, to his living day, every time we met, he said, "I would have had you if that guy hadn't broken your couch," which is not altogether true. But I enjoyed the idea of going to Princeton. They didn't offer full rides because it's the Ivy, so it would have been a little more difficult to pay the tuition. And also becoming friends and knowing Bill Bradley also helped a lot. Bradley was playing for the Knicks. I'd meet him for coffee periodically before Knick games. So, all of those were great experiences. But ultimately, I chose Coach Driesell and Coach Raveling and the Maryland experience for a lot of reasons. And, it's probably the best choices that I ever made.
Certainly worked out well from a lot of different angles, including the caliber of play that you got involved in. And our mutual friend Special K was saying, "Look at this game this guy was in, this Len Elmore college game, ACC championship." And if I'm not mistaken, this was at a time where only one team from the conference got to the NCAA tournament. So it was one of these winner take all situations, survive and move on before the tournament even got underway in the ACC championship run. And your Maryland team, which had some pretty celebrated players on it, along with you, took on the NC State team that had what? David Thompson. It's a really mixed bag. I mean, you're looking at a super athletic, powerful player that also has finesse and grace. And then on top of that, they had Tom Burleson, who was a freak at like, what was he, like 7'4", this guy? He weighed 160 pounds, but he wasn't terrible. And then they had a guy that looked like he came out of the circus, basically, by basketball standards, Monty Tao. Tell us about that game. Take us back through your memories of that particular clash, because it turned out to be one of those games that should be ever held in the time capsule of basketball history.
Yeah, well, 50 years later, still painful. But no, they were our arch nemesis for 2 years, and a lot of it had to do with David Thompson. Tom Burleson, you're right, 7'4". He's a little more than 160. He weighed about 260. He was a little bit a bit heavier than I was, about 30, 40 pounds.
Oh,
But
yeah, that seems odd. Yeah.
combination of Burleson, Tao, and David Thompson was one that we just couldn't overcome. Our games for 2 years, we lost to them by low single digits. We played prior to that game you're talking about. We played on the first college basketball game on Super Bowl Sunday. We were preliminary to the Super Bowl game. We lose to them by one at home on a tip-in by David Thompson. He was the kind of guy that you really had trouble matching up with. Lefty would put bigger guys on him, and he'd outquick them. Put smaller guys on him, and he'd outjump them. So it made it difficult for us. We finally found a way to stop them in that game that you're talking about, where only one of us in the ACC tournament was going to the NCAA tournament. They were ranked number one in the nation, UCLA number two. We were number three. Here we are, number one and number three, playing against each other to go to the tournament for the national championship. We went to overtime. They beat us 103-100 in a game that Billy Packer, the late Billy Packer, said he thought was flawless, no unforced errors in that particular game. The pace was something where, we went up and down the floor. There was no 3-point shot. We shot over 50% from the field. They got to the line a heck of a lot more than we did. The game was played in Greensboro, North Carolina, so there's some explanation there. But nevertheless, Tom Burleson had probably the best game of his career. Prior to that, he shot 3 of 19 against me. And in that game, right. In that game, though, I was half playing David Thompson, trying to keep him out of the paint. And by the time I'd get back to Tom, he had the ability to get closer to the basket. And 7 inches taller than me, it was pretty hard to stop him. But take nothing away from them. They were a superb team, went on to win the national championship. Unfortunately, we stayed at home. We had won the NIT my sophomore year, invited again, but this time we said, look, all the things that we had accomplished this year, if emotionally we're not ready to play in the NIT and somebody beats us, all of our accomplishments, all the things that we meant to college basketball kind of go down the drain. So we decided to go back to school, see if we could, resurrect our academics my senior year, see if I could graduate on time, that type of stuff. But it was great to witness them win the national championship, recognizing that we lost to the eventual national champion. But a game like that to go to overtime with the talent we had, I think on the floor at one point in time there were 7 NBA draft picks. You'll never see that again.
Yeah, and you remember the vivid image of Alvana running around looking for somebody to hug after the championship game, and you don't realize. I mean, you see this sometimes in sports. I've seen it in boxing, where a good friend of mine, Howard Davis, who was part of that big '76 Olympic boxing team that won all the gold medals, and he won a gold medal there, and just to get to the Olympic team, he had to beat a guy named Hilmer Kenny out of the Kronk Gym, who went on to win a world title. I think he was the first world title winner from the Kronk Gym, and Emmanuel Stewart. And then he had to beat Aaron Pryor, who, of course, was a conqueror of Alexis Arguello and what was a great fighter. And that was just to make the team. And that's kind of how it was back then. There wasn't this wide open thing where 64 teams get into the tournament, or now 68. And what's also interesting, Len, that you bring up, my first college basketball game I ever attended was an NIT doubleheader at Madison Square Garden. This had to be late 60s, like 68, 69. And it was still considered very prestigious. I remember Kansas came in there with JoJo White, and Dayton, the Flyers, had Donnie May, who went on to a reasonable career with the Knicks, although he wasn't a prototype professional player per se. And I'll never forget, I was thinking, wow, this is the biggest thing I've ever attended. And then, as you were saying, a few years later, it was one of those invitations that you sort of tossed aside and said, "Oh, not this year. Oh, we've already done that." And
Although it was pretty prestigious still.
yeah,
Because remember, I mean, the other conferences, had winners who could go with automatic bids, and there were still some pretty darn good teams who didn't go and ultimately went to the NIT. We just decided that we'd already won it one time, but again, the following year they changed the rules. They expanded the field and gave some at-large bids. Of course, that didn't help us, but we recognize that we helped change college basketball with a loss.
and then the next year, didn't you come out of the shoot, and that was your battle with Walton? Your head-to-head with Bill Walton.
No, actually, that was earlier that same season,
Okay.
70
And what
first.
was it like to tangle with Walton? Because he was, I mean, you talk about fundamentally sound and having those New York fundamentals. This was a guy that was the epitome of the Big F. He was that Big F on the top of the fundamental chart, and was probably the most clever interior passer we've seen in a long, long time from the post. What was it like taking on a guy that was so sound in every aspect of the game, and then played it with an enthusiasm that he only shared maybe when he was hanging out with Jerry Garcia doing mushrooms and watching the Grateful Dead?
Well, I mean, it was certainly a challenge. Remember, the year before that, they won the national championship. He had that outrageous game where it was maybe score was 22
21
out
out
of
of 22. Yeah.
21 out of 22. And I took that videotape and watched it all summer, recognizing that we would open our season with that.
That'd
Watched
be
every
nice. Yeah. Did you get any
rain.
sleep?
Yeah, not the night before the game, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But when we the opening tip, they get the ball, they come down, throw it into him. I knew exactly what he was going to do. I could watch his footwork. Blocked his first shot. He got it back, blocked the second one. And he looked at me and said, "Nice goaltend," but it wasn't. In fact, I know the second one I swatted so hard it went out of bounds over Coach Wooden's head. He had his program all rolled up, and when it came, he had to duck. He was almost hit him. But the third one, that's the one that we're on the cover of Sports Illustrated for. He got me up in the air and I fouled him. But Bill, most recently, before he passed, we were on a podcast together earlier, and he admitted it was probably the toughest game that he had played, worst game that he had shot. He shot 8 for 24 that game. Did corral a ton of rebounds because he never left the paint. I had a pretty good game. I think I had 18 and 15. And, we outscored them 9-0 in the last 2 minutes, but came up short. We got John Lucas, our superior point guard, got hand checked out of bounds. We lost the ball, and, that was the end of it. You lose to UCLA at Pauley Pavilion by 1. That probably means that on a neutral court, you beat them by 10. But that's only speculation. But they were a great team. They lost to NC State that year in the national championship, the one that we
Oh.
didn't get to go to.
Len Elmore, our special guest here on Conversations. So much to get to here. You start your pro career in what was the ABA with Indiana. Uh, a couple of years away from the merger, so the conditions might have changed. But I always dug like anything about. I had a neighbor. His name was Jim McKinley. He was a defensive coordinator with Missouri. His main guy was Woody Woodenhofer, and Woodenhofer took over the Oklahoma Outlaws in the USFL for a period of time. And I used to sit around for days on end just listening to his stories about the USFL, which they thought was on the threshold of making it. They were about to turn a corner until a guy named Trump came into the picture there and buried him once and for all. Not that history might be repeating itself somewhere in the next couple of weeks, but the stories were incredible, and we know the ABA had its ups and downs at the very least. But what was it like? I mean, this experience when you first come into the ABA with the Indiana Pacers, or were they getting close to the point where you didn't have to worry if your paycheck was going to bounce like one of those Spaldings you used to play punch ball with in Brooklyn?
We did our research. My agent and I had done research. First of all, I was drafted in the first round by the ABA, by the Pacers, and also by the Washington. At that time, they were called the Bullets, which was kind of the hometown since they were only about 8 or 10 miles away from the University of Maryland. But recognizing that it was a bidding war, we did our research and recognized that Indiana was financially solvent and would be. I think what the Bullets did, and obviously I would have loved to have played for them, but what they did was they lowballed me, not believing that the Pacers were solvent enough to offer the contract and the security that they did. I mean, the merger had been in talks several years before it actually occurred. And so I can tell you one of the greatest signs of solvency for the Pacers is that the chairman of the board for the Indiana Pacers also was the chairman of the board for the Indiana National Bank. So we figured
That helps, yeah.
they had a few shekels, although we didn't have any worries there. And the Washington team offered me 3 years guaranteed. I mean, 3 years contract, only 2 years guaranteed. While the Pacers offered me 6 years guaranteed at twice the money. So I mean, what could I do? And quite honestly, it was highly competitive in the ABA that first year. We wound up going to the championship, lost to a Hubie Brown coached Kentucky Colonel team that had Dan Issel, that had Artis Gilmore, that had Louis Dampier. I mean, they had a great team, and we wound up losing to them. And my team was George McGinnis, Billy
Was
Knight.
Larry Brown on that team, the Kentucky Colonels team, too?
Larry Brown was coaching at the time, the Denver Nuggets.
Okay.
And we actually beat them to get to the finals. They had been undefeated on their floor throughout the whole season. But when we get to the playoffs, we beat them 3 games on their home floor in the playoffs. So we kind of upset that apple cart. But when you look at the talent in the ABA, I always tell people you don't think that the talent measured up. Take a look at the merger occurred in 1976. That was the first season, and that was actually a season I was injured and missed almost the whole season because of torn ligaments in my right knee. But if you take a look at the 1977 All-Star game and look at the representation from the ABA, proportionally, only 4 teams made it as far as being incorporated into the NBA. And there are a significant amount of All-Stars who are ABA players that were on the All-Star team. So that told you something. But overall, I think it was a fun league. They still had the 3-point shot, although it was taken more judiciously than it is today.
Yeah.
More of a wide open game, great athletes, and it was fun. I have very fond memories of playing for 2 years in the NBA.
Like I said, I was always a fan of the Renegade League. I love the AFL. NFL was old stodgy stuff, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. AFL, they're slinging the ball. Joe Willie's wearing the white shoes. He's firing the rock down the field there at Shea in the wind. Fans are going crazy. You're watching a wide open attack. And a similar parallel, I guess, to the ABA and NBA style of play, where you had a much more conservative style of play. I think they were still running the weave out of Red Auerbach's playbook. And the ABA, you got Dr. J doing all this flamboyant stuff, and Connie Hawkins and some of the other stars in the league that were more reminiscent of some of the real old school guys like Elgin Baylor and some of the high wire circus acts that you had at one time in the NBA. All right, so what was the transition like? You end up with what, a 10-year career in the pros, Len Elmore, and what was the transition like when Indiana went from being an ABA team to an NBA team? How much different were the conditions, the circumstances, and the enjoyment of the game?
It wasn't much different. As I said, that first year I missed. I tore my ligaments in my preseason camp, and I wound up trying to play. I played like 6 games with a brace that was so heavy that eventually just said couldn't do it. So, I missed the rest of that year, which I wish I had been a part of it. But, the transition was not that difficult. I mean, travel was a bit different. The hotels, were a little more upscale, but the competition was literally the same. You saw different teams, so you saw a vast array of talent as opposed to the more condensed ABA schedule because we didn't have as many teams. But overall, I mean, you really didn't see a whole lot of difference in the game. And eventually, when they accepted the 3-point line, it just seemed more and more like playing in the NBA.
All right, and after your career's over, you obviously had options. When did you get your law degree? Did you have that while you were playing? Obviously, Harvard Law. I mean, it's not like you went to the University of Guam, and got a shingle there. It's strict, discipline, highest level of legal training that you can possibly get. How did that come about? And then, what were your options when you finished playing pro basketball?
Well, first of all, I had always wanted to be a lawyer. Since I was a kid, I used to love Perry Mason. Wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, and really utilize it to have some impact on society. That was during the time, as I mentioned, the war in Vietnam was raging, civil rights movement was at its peak, and I wanted to be in the parade rather than being a bystander. But basketball, as I say, got in the way after graduating at the University of Maryland. I'm still playing basketball, and so it wasn't until my next to last year that I realized pain. I'm getting older. My skill set was starting to deteriorate. What am I going to do? As well as I was compensated, it wasn't anywhere near what these guys are, and I knew that I couldn't retire and play golf for the rest of my life, and I wanted to fulfill those career aspirations. So, between my ninth and 10th year, I studied for the LSATs, the LSAT, and took a preparatory course, took the exam, um, played my 10th year with the Knicks. And, we're about to play the Celtics in the playoffs. And I get this letter in the mail. Prior to that, I had applied to a bunch of schools. University of Maryland, some other schools that I thought I could get into easily. And my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, challenged me and said, "Well, why aren't you applying to the best?" I said, "What best?" She says, "Well, what about Harvard or Yale or someone?" I said, "They're not going to take me. I'm too old. I'm this. I'm that." Well, she challenged me, and I did apply. And as I said, in April, we're about to go play the Celtics, and I get this letter in the mail, and I think it's the declination. I opened it up, and I was accepted. I was shocked. They also offered me a year deferment that I could defer a year and come back if I was interested. And I really wasn't sure. So we play in the playoffs. We're in Boston. We have a day off. I decided, let me go check this place out. So I get on the T, go to Cambridge, walk around Harvard Square. I'm on campus. I walk along the Commons and I go into the library, Langdale Library. And finally, when I came out, I said, you know what? I could be here, weighing the pain that I was going through and the lack of time, etc. And finally, I just decided to retire with no fanfare whatsoever. I told the Knicks, "Hey, I'm leaving." Matter of fact, I had another year left on my contract, but I think the GM was Dave DeBuscher, if I'm not mistaken, and they granted me that final year. Wasn't a whole lot of money, but they granted me the final year, and the next year I was on campus and pursuing a degree. And my options, I could have worked in corporate law, but I had made a decent amount of money. I wanted to give something back. I had a choice of being a defense attorney or a prosecutor. A couple of experiences led me to, work in Brooklyn, New York for a progressive prosecutor and Elizabeth Holtzman. And as a trial attorney, which is what I wanted to be, I got 4 years of experience there.
You either were a part of or the founder of what looked like it was going to be a wildly successful sports agency at one time, and I think you had some phenomenal number of lottery picks that were signed to your agency, and you were representing in one form or another as NBA players. But you got out of that. What turned you around on that? I think I know the story and the answer, but did it have anything to do with a word like entourage? Is that what discouraged you from being in the agent business? And what was that experience like for somebody as obviously intelligent and disciplined as you and dedicated to the right things to be a part of what is a wild celebrity fantasy scene in many ways?
I mean, it's certainly entourage is part of it. But real quickly, I mean, after I left the DA's office, I went into somewhat of a private practice, but I also had an opportunity to work in television. Started in the middle of law school, but continued. So I was a sports announcer, and but I was also getting uh, notes. I was getting called by people to, you know, take a look at what's going on in this business, and the number of players who were defrauded, the number of players who finished and wound up with no money whatsoever and needed guidance. And ultimately, I made a decision. Maybe that's another way to give back. Utilize my skills in that regard. So I started my sports agency company, and it lasted for about 5 years. And you're right, we had a number of first round picks, several lottery picks, including the number one pick in Joe Smith at the time. My motto was, I've been through what you're about to go through. I understand, how to conduct business and created a career after sports. And this is where you guys need to go. If you needed a role model, et cetera, I could serve as that. But the difficulty was, as time grew on and as the money became larger and larger, the compensation for players, other agents were more than willing to pay under the table to get clients, to pay the entourage and the families to get clients. And I had a reputation. I also had a law license that I didn't want to jeopardize. And so, really, after in my fifth year, after I lost a client because someone else came in, offered them more money, even though we recognized that all the things they complained about, had no basis. I finally said, look, in order to compete, I'm going to have to do the same thing these guys are doing, and I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to, jeopardize my reputation or my legal license, my law license. So, I decided after that maybe there's another way that I can help, and fortunately, going forward, I had other ways that I helped, my fellow players through being president of the National Basketball Retired Players Association, handling other cases outside in my law practice. But I just wish that the environment was different because I enjoyed really helping the guys that I represented.
Are you at all startled? I know everything always escalates, and you'll see a quarterback get a contract, and it looks outrageous, and then the next guy gets another 50 million. Are you astounded by the numerology? Where I remember, you're seeing guys that you would consider to be, and not to be denigrating, they're pro players, but scrubs. And then you'll see him get signed away on a restricted free agent contract, even going back 5, 6 years ago. 5 years, 55, $60 million. Is this sort of astounding to you, Len Elmore, to see where the salaries have gone in the NBA, or is it just something that because they were unbalanced and more in favor of the owners for so many years, that now with these collective bargaining agreements and shared revenues, with the amazing amount of dollars that are being generated in all markets, including overseas now, that the money had to eventually come to this, where you're seeing guys sign for $250 million for 4 or 5 years.
Not astounded, recognizing where the media rights deals, which is really what drives it, although there's other basketball related income. I'm not astounded by it, and you could see it coming, but I didn't realize it would come this quickly. I was at a Columbia Sports Management Conference where I teach and work, and we had Adam Silver as a guest, and Adam related that the average salary it's $11 million for an NBA player. This is kind of like what you said, and to recognize that being the case, how far we came. I know when I played, the average salary was about 120,000 dollars, which is nothing to
It was
scream
big
at.
then,
Right?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing to complain about. But to have those numbers there is absolutely amazing, and it's a tribute to the growth of the game. I can't complain about it. I can only say that I'm proud, as many of my contemporaries are, that they stood upon our shoulders to do that because every year, the game became more and more popular. The media rights became more and more valuable, and also great negotiation by the union to accomplish getting 51% of all basketball related income. That's major.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, it was really setting the pace for a league that looked like it was on the threshold of extinction before they finally came to this agreement. The numerology might have been a little bit different in terms of the percentage that the players got, and certainly the revenue was vastly different. But nonetheless, if they hadn't come to this agreement many years ago with the shared revenue, there was a possibility they were showing on tape delay the championship games. The NBA, you couldn't have easily envisioned the status that it would eventually go on to achieve as it enjoys today. All right, so you end up getting into broadcasting, as you mentioned, Len Elmore, and people that view on the Bleacher Brothers our conversations every week probably are familiar with you doing either a college game or a pro game, and you worked with some very distinguished people, and then you were on the call, and I would imagine this man was kind of generous. He just seemed like that type of guy that would give the color analyst a chance to go ahead and do his thing. But were you not on the call, the television broadcast of the Leitner shot during the NCAA tournament, where he got the three-quarter court pass at the free throw line, fired, and boom? I mean, this was not a brick from straight away. It went right through. Were you on? You were on that call, I believe.
Yep, I was with Vern Lundquist, and Vern was with play-by-play, and he obviously did a terrific job. And I deferred when action starts. I defer to him, but setting up the strategy, I had done Duke earlier, several times earlier that year, and always they would, with a couple of seconds left in that situation, they'd throw the ball at half court, call another timeout, and then try to set up. But Rick Pitino failed to put anybody on the passer, which I thought was kind of crazy since everybody was in the forecourt.
Yeah.
So, Grant Hill had a clear view on where to throw it. And then he put it up in the air, and none of the Kentucky players went after the ball. The ball's in the air, it belongs to everybody. And I can still recall seeing John Pelfrey, who was guarding Leitner, one of the people guarding Leitner, take a step backwards. Because I'm sure in the huddle, Rick Pitino told his guys, don't foul, don't foul. But nevertheless, the ball went straight to Leitner. He was able to turn and take that shot. And remember, he was perfect from the field. He was 9 for 9 prior to that shot, and ultimately, made it. And it was considered because of the closeness and actually because of the dynamic nature of the players in that game. You had guys who really foreshadowed how the game would be played today. Not only in Leitner was his size, being able to shoot longer perimeter shots, but a guy like Jamal Mashburn for Kentucky, who kind of defied the size at 6'8". A lot of 6'8" guys play with their back to the basket, but he was able to face the basket, shoot from outside, play inside. It was a tough matchup. So all of those things combined made that game special. And then, of course, the sudden ending to it. A lot of people think that game was greater than ours with NC State and Maryland in 1974. And for varying reasons, you could say it might have been, particularly the sudden ending. But I've just had the pleasure of playing in one game and announcing the other.
Yeah, and Duke universally despised by many. You seem to, sort of make a face when you mention Duke in a positive light. Probably, no doubt, going back to your experiences against them. Leitner, one of those guys that everybody thought was an on-court asshole, so naturally they were rooting for him to miss. And yet, I think between and I've seen the 30 for 30 that ESPN did on Leitner, and it's really very compelling because you start to see sort of a different side of his whole mentality. But was he vastly underrated as one of the better college players of all time? You don't hear his name mentioned with the greats, but man, he was a pretty tough out there when he was playing for the Blue Devils.
Yeah, no, Christian Laettner was very talented. I'm not sure, if you're talking about the top 10 players in
Yeah,
college
you wouldn't
basketball,
think of him in that light.
sure, yeah, I'm not sure you would think one there, but for his period, he was a dominating player. And, quite honestly, he had a little bit of attitude towards him. I know
Yeah,
during the game, he steps on a guy's chest and,
he's like
you know,
Grayson
like,
Allen was later on for the Duke Blue Devils. A guy you just wanted to see somebody. I mean, you don't want to pull a Kermit Washington, but you just want to see somebody slug the guy.
well, I gave him the benefit of the doubt when he stepped on the guy's chest,
Yeah,
but Vern Lundquist corrected me quickly. I said he might not have done it on purpose, and Vern said, "Oh,
Burns
yes,
said,
he
"Oh
did."
yeah, yeah, no,
And,
that's
and in
that's
fact,
later."
and in fact, he did. But yeah, and when you talk about Duke and my attitude, I can tell you this: my experience with Duke as a player, we had no trouble with them, so I wasn't really worried about that. And just watching them play, they were a dominant team. They got some calls at home periodically, and
Yeah.
that carries over in today. But they're a quality program. Mike Krzyzewski did great things with that program, and it continued.
All right. One of your distinctions, you're on a thing called the Knight Commission, which is a commission that's been designated to try and study intercollegiate athletics at various different levels. I would think, academics and the whole thing. Where does it stand right now? I remember having a very interesting conversation with you years ago on the air, and you were talking about the state of affairs in college sports. If you could capsulize, what are we really looking at right now? I mean, who's in control? Is there any control? Is there a way to legislate things so that you get the so-called equity people are looking for? Is there really any emphasis on academics? Or where does it all stand, if you can summarize it?
Well, I mean, from a standpoint of the Knight Commission, I mean, the commission was convened back in the early 90s because of some of the scandals, including lack of academic integrity, some of the other cheating scandals that had really played college sports since its beginning, beginning at the end of the 1800s and the turn of the century. But we recognize that the college game, because of its value to the community, had a lot to do with its education centric profile, and it needs to remain that. Right now, it is getting so close to the professional model, and it has been for a long time. Commercialism has creeped in and pretty much taken over, and a lot of it has to do with revenue, with being able to generate revenue, which in many ways is nothing wrong, but a lot of it doesn't go to the education or academic portion of the university, but it goes straight to the athletic departments to build bigger facilities, to be able to, give greater benefits in many ways for recruiting efforts, to build coaches' salaries that, some projected, without some kind of scrutiny could surpass what students are getting over the next couple of years. But the litigation that has kind of plagued college sports and the NCAA going back to the 1984 NCAA versus Oklahoma Board of Regents, which took away their power to regulate college football, all the way up to O'Bannon, which punished the NCAA for abrogating name, image, and likeness, the ability for student athletes to exploit right to publicity. Then you have Alston, which gives them, a greater right to more benefits if an institution wants to give to them more education-related benefits, all the way to House, which again goes back. The settlement goes back and pays a penalty or settlement money to student athletes, primarily football and some basketball, for lost ability to exploit the name, image, and likeness since 2016, and also it provides an opportunity to share in revenue going forward. I think 22% for schools that opt into that can share revenue, and this all becomes a recruiting tool because if you're not part of that, it's going to be hard for you to Division One to recruit athletes. So we're going into a commercialism that is similar, if not surpasses that of the professional game. And now it opens up a question of whether or not these student athletes are employees or not. And once you're employees, that's a whole different set of rules, and maybe even a whole different ball game with regard to treatment of college athletes. Add to that the transfer portal that allows athletes to transfer from school to school without having to sit out a year, or depending on the rule, it gives them an opportunity to transfer at least once. You've seen kids play for four schools in 4 years, which kills the continuity for coaches and programming. So there are so many different things that have kind of what I call mutilated the original idea of the game of college athletics. And then when you talk about the commercialism and money, football and men's basketball seem to get the large portion of it. But what about the Olympic sports and the impact on budgets and how Olympic sports are treated going forward? There are just so many instances. That's a whole different show that we could conduct to be able to talk about it. But the bottom line, in summary, is unless there is a strong regulator, and I wrote an article saying the Wild Wild West needs a strong marshal. That's what this is right now, with unfettered authority to control and recognizing some of the progress that we made in giving athletes opportunity for revenue and compensation greater than what we receive, $15 a month. Unless you have somebody who's going to be able to regulate that, it's going to spiral out of control and ultimately won't be the thing that people expect it to be, won't be the public trust that serves the community.
I know it was a long time ago, but when they used to give us the $3 traveling on the bus for meal money when you went on a road game playing baseball at Syracuse, that was like a gift from the gods, as it was enough money to actually do something with. And as you mentioned, you used to get $15 cash. The NCAA, though, it seemed like they kind of did themselves in by hanging
Yeah.
on to this greed forever when these cases were sort of pending, and they might have been able to settle them in a much more favorable fashion to keep their control over things. I always felt, Len Elmore, that the NCAA was no better of a regulating body than, say, the World Boxing Council or the IBF, one of its brothers and sisters, the International Bribery Federation. It just seemed like, and now they're taking grasp at things and going, well, you know what, we're going to look into that NIL deal. I don't. What is there to look into? Do they even have regulating power anymore?
Well, I mean, with this House settlement, they would have the ability to appoint a third party to scrutinize NIL deals and make sure they're not essentially pay for play deals, that they actually have some commercial value, that, the student athlete who's getting the money is actually doing something for it other than just coming in to play sports. But you're right with your point that they could have grabbed hold of this thing and exercised better control and regulation, and maybe avoided some of the other lawsuits in the O'Bannon case. But they held on with hubris, saying that amateurism is still a goal, which in fact it wasn't. They were taking advantage of the commercialism through the one championship that was making a ton of money that they could control, which was the men's basketball tournament, March Madness, and not sharing it. I think all of those things, that kind of arrogance, pointed towards, the litigation that we have now. Instead of changing with the times to a certain extent, well, maintaining, their authority. Now they have very little authority whatsoever.
I don't even know if they have a post office box anymore in Kansas with tumbleweed blowing by it. All right, quick thought. Toughest guy you ever tangled with? Some guy that was just going to break your ribs, and the night of the game, you thought to yourself, this is the last guy I want to face. Anybody come to mind right away?
Actually, no. And the
Okay.
reason why is because I wasn't afraid of any of those guys. I mean,
Oh,
people
cool.
talk about enforcers like
Yeah,
Maurice Lucas or Ricky Mahorn or people like that.
right.
You know, I held my own with them, and I always wondered why people thought that they were enforcers. And in fact, knowing them, they were sweethearts. They had a persona that they tried to affect on a lot of people, but then I had no problem with him. Now, when you talk about toughest as far as skill and talent, I mean, guys in the middle who are bigger and stronger, Artis Gilmore, Bob Lanier to some extent, certainly Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. When I had to face them, kind of struck fear in my heart because I was an undersized center. It's hard to deal with those guys when
Yeah.
they were on.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, and I want to thank you so much for being with us. It's always fascinating, Len Elmore. Terrific stuff. Are you you're gonna be at this conference coming up in December, and that's one of your retired players organizations deals?
Which conference are we
Oh,
talking
I
about?
thought you were coming down here with Special K. I
Oh
was
no,
just
I'm not. Unfortunately, I've still got to teach. That's still during the fall semester. I've got finals that I've got to administer, and so I'm going to miss that luncheon that they always have, old timers luncheon.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's going to be a blast. I'm looking forward to being there because you guys have great stories to tell, and it was fascinating following the different footsteps of your career, and of course the things you're doing today, and obviously involved in trying to administrate and help out with some of these issues that look like they're going to be somewhat else solvable in a short period of time. Len, thanks so much for joining us here on this week's edition of Conversations. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Len Elmore, ladies and gentlemen, with us on Conversations here on the Bleacher Brothers.